Okay, so today we are diving deep into a really provocative piece of work, Chris Hedges' 2007 book, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War on America. It's definitely a charged title.
It absolutely is. And just to be clear up front, our goal here isn't to get into the political back and forth itself.
Right. We want to analyze Hedges' argument, his journalism. He puts forward this really strong thesis.
He does. He argues that what's often called the Christian right had, even back then, built the ideological architecture of a Christian fascism in the U.S. That's his term.
So our mission for you listening is to understand what he meant by that. What structures, what strategies was he documenting?
And it's worth noting who Hedges is, Pulitzer Prize winner, National Book Award finalist, but also, crucially, someone with a theological background.
Yeah, that's key, isn't it? He went to Harvard Divinity School. His father was a Presbyterian minister.
Exactly. So he's bringing that perspective. He's critiquing the movement's use of religion, partly from within a religious framework, you could say. He's looking at how they interpret the Bible.
Which he sees as very different from his own upbringing, right? His background emphasized what? Humility, questioning.
Precisely. Humility, questioning, acknowledging that humans don't have a perfect grasp of God's will. He contrasts that with what he saw in the movement, a tendency towards treating the Bible as a literal, absolute political instruction manual.
Okay, let's start with the core thesis then. This idea of Christian fascism. What did Hedges actually mean? He wasn't saying it was identical to, say, 1930s Germany.
No, not in terms of goose-stepping or explicit calls for dictatorship, not at that point anyway. His argument was more about the ideological foundations. He saw the structure, the framework being built.
So the ideas, the institutions, they were in place.
Right. He argued it was all set up, basically waiting for a moment, maybe a major crisis, to fully activate and push for power openly. It's a kind of fascism built on ideology and organization first.
And he stresses this wasn't an overnight thing. It had deep roots.
Definitely. He points back like 25 years before the book to early televangelists, figures like Pat Robertson.
Robertson was already talking about Christian dominion way back then.
According to Hedges, yes. Articulating visions that, by 2007, Hedges felt had become surprisingly mainstream within that movement, and even parts of the political right.
And you see that mainstreaming in politics, too. Hedges mentions Jerry Falwell, for example.
Yeah, Falwell's journey from sort of the fringes to becoming a major political power broker is something Hedges documents.
There's that anecdote about John McCain, isn't there? How he initially called Falwell an agent of intolerance.
And then later, when McCain was running for president, he was actively seeking Falwell's support. Hedges uses that to show the movement's increasing political gravity.
It pulled established figures towards it.
Right, which leads to some interesting tensions Hedges observed, especially during the George W. Bush years. Bush courted the movement, needed its space.
But it wasn't always a smooth relationship.
Not entirely. Hedges points to clashes, particularly over issues like immigration. You had the movement's base, often quite nativist.
Wanting stricter controls, cultural purity, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But then you had the corporate side of the Republican coalition, which often benefited from or even depended on immigrant labor.
So a real conflict there. How did Hedges see that playing out?
He argued it led to a kind of difficult balancing act for the administration, sometimes resulting in ambiguity, trying not to alienate either the powerful grassroots or the corporate interests. The movement was strong enough to make it an issue, but maybe not always strong enough to dictate policy against business needs.
Okay, so that's the political side. But how did the movement build that kind of influence? Hedges talks about this parallel information system. Sounds pretty ominous.
It's central to his argument about creating an insular world for followers. It's this massive infrastructure.
So like Christian TV and radio.
Huge networks, yeah, reaching tens of millions. Hedges saw it as a deliberate alternative to secular news and culture, a way to constantly reinforce the ideology and filter out opposing views.
Creating its own reality almost.
Pretty much. And it wasn't just media. It included their own publishing houses, producing books and materials, and very importantly, their own educational system.
Schools and universities.
Yes, from K-12 through college. Hedges argued the ideology was embedded right through the curriculum, teaching history, science, everything through that specific lens, creating generations grounded in that worldview.
And Hedges actually went inside some of this, didn't he? He didn't just analyze from afar.
No, he did firsthand research. He mentions attending week-long classes on conversion techniques.
Wow. So formalized training on how to recruit.
Exactly. He saw it as very systematic, turning faith into a methodology for political recruitment and mobilization. It wasn't just about personal belief. It was about organized action.
And linking that to specific political goals.
Right. He observed how people were mobilized for grassroots activities, like pro-life rallies or campaigns on specific social issues, tying deeply felt religious conviction directly to lobbying and political pressure. It's all connected: pulpit, classroom, protest.
Let's go back to the theological angle for a moment, using Hedges' background. This literal interpretation of the Bible, why did he see that as so fundamental to the fascist ideology he was describing?
Well, think about it. If you believe the Bible is a literal, inerrant instruction manual directly from God, covering every aspect of life and society.
Then there's no room for doubt or debate.
Exactly. It eliminates the need for compromise, for negotiation, for the messiness of democracy. Hedges contrasts this with his own tradition, which emphasizes, the limits of human understanding.
So claiming absolute certainty based on a literal reading
Becomes the justification for absolute political power. If your political goals are seen as God's literal commands, then any opposition, any democratic process that gets in the way isn't just wrong, it's potentially evil.
And that provides the moral engine, in Hedges' view, for what he called that concerted drive to destroy American democracy.
That's the connection he makes. That certainty fuels the political project, and he argues it was succeeding in embedding itself.
He talks about the movement burrowing deep inside the American government. How deep did he think it went?
He cited figures back in 2007 showing hundreds of senators and congresspeople getting high approval ratings from the big Christian right advocacy groups.
So not just fringe influence, core political power.
Yes, he saw it as establishing a kind of litmus test within a major party. You needed the movement's stamp of approval to survive and thrive politically, at least in many districts.
But the really unsettling part of his analysis is this idea of the waiting crisis. He uses 9/11 as a key example. Explain that.
Hedges saw the ideological structure, the media system, the political inroads, all of it as being basically ready, poised
Poised for what?
for a crisis. A major shock to the system could be economic collapse, another major attack, severe social unrest, something big enough to shake public faith in existing institutions.
Why is the crisis so important to the theory?
Because Hedges believed that in normal, stable times, democratic checks and balances, even if weakened, can often resist this kind of ideological takeover. But a massive crisis creates fear, uncertainty.
A desire for strong, simple answers.
Precisely. And that's the moment, Hedges argued, when a movement offering absolute certainty, divine justification, and promising restoration could make its move. The crisis provides the opportunity to push the already built architecture into full operation.
This brings us to the historical parallels, which is probably the most controversial part of the book. He directly compares this movement to earlier ones.
He does. He explicitly draws parallels with early fascist movements in Italy and Germany in the 1920s and 30s.
That's a heavy comparison. What similarities was he pointing to? Not necessarily the end result, but the methods.
Right, the mechanisms of gaining power. He identified several key things. First, defining an enemy blaming societal problems on a specific group, like secularists, liberals, minorities.
Creating an us versus them.
Definitely. Second, harnessing patriotism and religious feeling to build a devoted, mobilized base that follows authority. Third, creating that parallel structure, the media, the schools, to bypass mainstream discourse and control the narrative.
So building power within the democratic system while fundamentally opposing its values.
That's the core of his warning, that these movements mask their totalitarian impulses while gaining influence, often exploiting the tolerance of the very democratic society they aim to dismantle. He felt democracy is vulnerable when it becomes too tolerant of the intolerant, especially when faith is manipulated for political ends.
It's a combination of his investigative work and that unique theological lens he brought.
Yeah, it makes for a powerful, if disturbing, analysis. He lays out the structure, the ideology, the strategy.
So wrapping this up, what's the takeaway? We've looked at Hedges' dissection of this movement, its ideology, its media machine, its political integration, and this chilling historical warning.
Well, the book certainly made waves. It sparked a lot of debate in academic circles and journalism, places like Democracy. Now, NPR covered it, and even within religious communities. Christian Century reviewed it. It forced a conversation.
A conversation about whether some faith-based movements were acting more like, well, revolutionary political forces than traditional interest groups.
Exactly. He put the focus on the mechanisms of power building, this idea of a parallel system seeking dominance.
And maybe the final thought to leave you, the listener, with comes back to that waiting crisis idea.
Right. Hedges wrote this almost 2 decades ago, with 9/11 fresh in mind. Thinking about today, all the instability, polarization, economic anxieties, climate fears.
What might constitute that kind of trigger event now?
It's the question Hedges leaves hanging. What kind of crisis, if any, could push that ideological architecture he described from a position of influence into attempting full political control?
Hmm.
This sobering thought based on the framework he laid out.